Thunder echoed through the mountains like a war drum when Marcus Tavares saw the luxury car skid violently on the wet curve, spin 3 times in the air and disappear down the steep slope, swallowed by the dense fog that transformed the afternoon into a gray nightmare. For an endless instant, he stood paralyzed on the muddy shoulder, his heart hammering against his ribs, the memories of that rainy night 3 years ago exploding in his mind like painful fireworks. The night he lost Sophia. The night the rain took half his soul. But then something stronger than fear took hold of him. Something primal and inevitable. He ran. He ran as if his own legs could rewrite the past. Even with the storm crashing down on him like a curse, even with the mud sucking at his boots with each desperate step, even without knowing if anyone in that wreckage was still breathing, he ran because he knew intimately the terror of being alone waiting for help that never arrives in time. And he had sworn, before Sophia's grave, that he would never let another human being die alone in the darkness. If you believe that kindness and second chances still matter in this world, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe to Blaze Stories. This helps stories like this reach more hearts. Marcus reached the destroyed vehicle while the rain transformed the world into an impenetrable liquid curtain. The car was on its side, the wheels still spinning uselessly in the air, shattered glass glittering like deadly diamonds scattered across the muddy grass. Smoke escaped from the crumpled hood, mixing with the fog like dancing phantoms. He forced the driver's door until it gave way with an anguished metallic groan. And there, trapped by the seatbelt, semi-conscious and bleeding from a deep cut above her left eyebrow, was a woman who seemed completely out of place in that desolation. Her name, he would discover later when she managed to speak between tremors, was Helena Cardoso. The ruthless CEO of Cardoso Enterprises, nationally known for her calculating coldness in negotiations, for never showing weakness, for building an empire on decisions others considered too cruel to execute. A woman whose world revolved around million-dollar contracts, private jets and air-conditioned boardrooms, never on treacherous mountain roads during apocalyptic storms. But in that precise moment, she was not powerful. She was not intimidating. She was nothing but a fragile and frightened creature, with purple lips from cold, her body trembling violently, her unfocused eyes struggling to find some point of reference in the reality crumbling around her. Marcus didn't waste time analyzing who she was or where she came from. He freed her from the belt with trembling but determined hands, feeling her weight against his chest when he took her in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost ethereal, as if life was already draining from her along with the blood staining her white silk blazer. Her lips moved weakly, trying to form words that never came to exist. Her eyes opened for a second, meeting his, and in that brief moment of connection he saw something that shocked him, absolute and pure vulnerability. Something a woman like Helena Cardoso would never allow the world to witness. The storm was worsening with an intensity that seemed purposeful, as if nature itself was testing his determination. Lightning tore the sky with blinding fury, briefly illuminating the hostile landscape before plunging it again into impenetrable darkness. He knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't be able to descend the mountain with her in his arms. Not under this torrential rain that turned each step into Russian roulette against death. Not with her losing body heat with each passing second. Not with the road transforming into a river of mud and loose stones. Hypothermia would kill her before they reached any hospital. Then he remembered the cabin. That old wooden structure he had discovered 2 years ago when he was teaching his 10-year-old son, Gabriel, to camp. A construction abandoned by loggers decades ago, hidden among giant eucalyptus and wild ferns, with walls covered in moss and a roof that seemed to be hanging by divine willpower. He had stored that location in his memory, thinking that one day he might need it. Today was that day. Carrying Helena to the cabin was like crossing through hell. Each step sank into the mud up to the ankle. Broken branches scratched his face and arms. Her weight, seemingly insignificant at first, multiplied with each conquered meter. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Because stopping meant death, and he had already experienced that pain enough times for a lifetime. By some inexplicable miracle, the cabin was still standing. The windows had been broken long ago, the door hung from a single rusty hinge, and the smell of mold was almost suffocating. But there was a roof that protected them from the murderous rain, 4 walls that blocked the cutting wind, and in the corner, covered by spider webs and decades of dust, was a small wood stove he had used on that trip with Gabriel. Marcus laid Helena on a pile of old burlap sacks he found in a corner, then moved with mechanical urgency. He pulled damp firewood from under the cabin, found yellowed newspapers in a rotted box, used the lighter he always carried in his pocket and, after 15 agonizing minutes of frustrated attempts, managed to make a small and stubborn flame be born in the stove. The smoke filled the cabin initially, making his eyes burn, but eventually found its way through the clogged chimney and the air began to clear. The heat spread slowly, timidly, like a child afraid of being rejected. Helena woke when twilight tinged the world purple through the broken windows. Her eyes opened slowly, confused, searching for something familiar in a completely alien environment. She tried to sit up, but her body protested with sharp pains and a deep tremor that came from within her bones. Marcus was by her side in seconds, offering water from his bottle, checking her temperature with the back of his hand against her forehead. She watched him with that expression wealthy people often have when confronted with genuine kindness, distrust mixed with confusion, as if kindness without expectation of payment were an alien concept. She still wore that white blazer stained with blood and mud, a black pencil skirt that was never designed for survival, and high heels that now seemed like medieval torture instruments. He found an old blanket in a dusty trunk, smelling of mothballs and forgotten memories, and placed it over her shoulders. She pulled it close as if it were the last living thing in the universe, her white fingers clutching the coarse fabric with silent desperation. As the heat from the stove penetrated her frozen bones, something in her face changed. The hard lines around her mouth softened. The calculating eyes that had destroyed careers and entire companies in boardrooms became just the eyes of a frightened, exhausted, and completely lost woman. They were no longer the eyes of Helena Cardoso, the CEO. They were just the eyes of Helena, the human. The afternoon dragged into night while the storm raged outside with a violence that seemed to increase rather than diminish. Lightning illuminated the cabin in stroboscopic flashes, revealing dancing shadows on the rotted walls. Thunder shook the fragile structure to its foundations. Mara tried several times to stand up, driven by some corporate instinct to maintain control, to not appear weak, but the cold had settled so deeply in her body that each movement was an agony. That's when it happened. When she looked at him, really looked for the first time, seeing beyond the man in worn flannel and calloused hands who had saved her. Seeing the human being who had risked his own life for a stranger. And then, with a voice so low it was almost lost in the roar of the storm, she whispered the words that would change everything between them. "Can I snuggle under your blanket?" There was no seduction in that question. There were no power games or calculated manipulation. There was only raw human need. There was fear of death. There was recognition that corporate titles and bank accounts meant absolutely nothing when you were freezing in an abandoned cabin in the middle of an apocalyptic storm. Marcus hesitated. Not because he doubted her intentions, but because that simple gesture crossed all the barriers he had built since Sophia died. He had become an expert at maintaining emotional distance, at helping without getting involved, at being kind without being vulnerable. But this wasn't about vulnerability. It was about survival. Hypothermia killed. And she was dangerously close to that deadly line. So he nodded, slowly, and opened the blanket. She moved close to him with trembling and awkward movements, like a wounded animal seeking warmth. Her shoulder pressed against his chest and he could feel every tremor that ran through her body. The heat between them grew gradually, first uncomfortable and strange, then necessary, and finally comforting in a way neither of them expected. She smelled of expensive perfume mixed with rain and blood, but underneath all that was something indefinable. Something human and real and completely unprotected. For the first time in 3 years, since Sophia left, Marcus felt the weight of another person trusting him completely. Not out of desire or obligation, but out of basic survival need that transcended all other considerations. Helena remained silent for a long time. Just breathing. Just existing. Listening to the storm outside and his steady heartbeat against her ear. And then, when the words finally came, they came out like a confession, as if she had been carrying that weight alone for too long. She admitted she wasn't used to receiving kindness without a built-in price. That every kind gesture in her life came with expectations, hidden agendas, and unwritten contracts. That she had become CEO at 28 when her father suffered a stroke during a shareholders' meeting, and since then had worked 18 hours a day, every day, transforming herself into someone even she didn't recognize when she looked in the mirror. That she hadn't taken a day off in 9 years. That she had sacrificed friendships, relationships, and even the chance to have her own family on the altar of corporate success. That her entire life was a calculated performance, and she had forgotten what it was like to simply be human. She didn't cry. Helena Cardoso didn't cry. But her voice trembled in a way no million-dollar contract had ever made her tremble. Marcus didn't respond with empty words of comfort or philosophical platitudes. He simply spoke about Gabriel, about the small but meaningful life he had built after the world crumbled around him. About how pain had forced him to learn that success isn't measured in money or power, but in moments, in children's laughter, in lazy weekend breakfasts, in helping strangers because that's the only thing that really matters in the end. He didn't pretend to be a hero. He didn't pretend to have answers. He just shared his truth with quiet honesty. The storm continued roaring outside, but inside the cabin something fundamental changed. Something melted between two people who had been frozen in their own self-inflicted prisons. The hours passed with that strange quality of time during crises, where minutes seem like hours and hours seem like seconds. Helena began to breathe more regularly, her body slowly coming back to life. Her head eventually rested against his shoulder, her heartbeat synchronizing with his in a way that wasn't romantic but was deeply intimate. He adjusted the blanket, making sure she was completely covered, and she murmured a thank you so soft it sounded like a prayer. When the storm finally diminished to a persistent drizzle the following morning, Marcus decided it was safe enough to signal for help. Using an emergency flare he always carried in his hiking backpack, he went out to the clearing and fired the red rocket into the cloudy sky. The bright trail cut through the fog like a scarlet promise of salvation. Within 2 hours, a rescue team located the cabin. Helena was immediately taken to the nearest hospital for treatment and observation. Marcus accompanied her, even secretly believing she would disappear back to her world of skyscrapers and power as soon as she was safe again. That he would be just a footnote in her life, a strange story to tell at corporate dinners. But he was wrong. The next day, when the sun finally appeared and the world seemed washed and new, Helena sought him out. She was different. Still elegant, still polished, but with something fundamental changed in her eyes. She stood before him not as a CEO, but as a woman trying to understand a version of herself she had forgotten existed. She thanked him not just for saving her life, but for something more precious, for showing that safety can come without conditions. That kindness can exist without agenda. That humanity is still possible in a world that often seems to have forgotten it completely. Marcus didn't know what the future held for them. But he knew something real had formed in that cabin. Not fairy tale romance. Not impossible promises. Just truth. Truth and humanity and genuine connection between two souls who had been lost in their own particular storms. She asked if she could meet Gabriel. He nodded, surprised and grateful. Their worlds were radically different, separated by social classes and life experiences that seemed insurmountable. But kindness, humility, and a night near death had built a fragile but real bridge between them. And sometimes that's all two broken human beings need to begin healing. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share, and subscribe to Blaze Stories. Your support helps us continue telling stories that remind the world what compassion really means. Special request, comment below. Would you help a stranger in a storm?